Let's get started. Story number 1.
The old grandfather clock in the corner of the living room stood tall and ominous, its pendulum swinging back and forth with an eerie, hypnotic rhythm. The clock had been in Claire's family for generations, its dark wood carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light of the fireplace. Her grandmother always warned her never to be in the room at midnight. It was a strange, cryptic warning that Claire had shrugged off as an old woman's superstition. But tonight was different. It was the first time Claire had returned to the family home since her grandmother's death. The house was cold, empty, and filled with shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. She had inherited the house, but it came with its quirks, odd noises, a sense of being watched, and of course, the grandfather clock. It was 11:50 p.m., and Claire was in the living room, sorting through old photo albums. She was lost in memories, smiling faintly at faded pictures of her as a child, sitting on her grandmother's lap. The clock's steady ticking filled the room, a sound she found oddly soothing, despite its volume growing louder as the minutes passed. At 11:55, she noticed something strange. The clock's pendulum had slowed, its swings becoming less precise. The ticking sound began to distort, no longer the sharp, mechanical noise she was used to. Instead, it sounded wet, almost like dripping water. Claire frowned and stood up, approaching the clock. She had always found it creepy as a child, but had never examined it closely. The carvings seemed even more intricate now, as though faces and figures were etched into the wood, their expressions twisted in agony. She touched the cold surface, her fingers tracing the grooves of what looked like a screaming face. The fire flickered, and the room grew colder. 11:58. A loud clang echoed from the clock, startling her. She stepped back, staring as the pendulum abruptly stopped mid-swing. The hands of the clock trembled violently, stuck at 1 minute to midnight. Then, slowly, they began to turn backward. "What the hell?" Claire whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint glow of the clock's face. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and writhing like ink in water. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she stepped back, her foot crunching against something on the floor. She looked down and saw shards of broken glass. Confused, she glanced at the coffee table, only to find the photo albums scattered across the floor, their pages torn. She hadn't heard them fall. 11:59. The air grew heavy, pressing against her chest. The shadows began to move, sliding across the floor and walls, creeping toward her like living tendrils. She stumbled back, her legs shaking as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The clock began to chime. The sound wasn't the deep, resonant chime of a normal clock. It was sharp, metallic, and deafening, like the screech of rusted metal being torn apart. Claire clapped her hands over her ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. The clock struck 12. The shadows reached her. They surged up her legs, cold and slimy, pulling her toward the clock. She screamed, thrashing against the invisible force, but the harder she fought, the tighter they gripped her. She was dragged across the floor, her nails scratching against the wood as the clock's face began to glow. It wasn't just light. The glow was a swirling vortex, a black void that seemed to suck in everything around it. The hands of the clock spun wildly, faster and faster, as if time itself were unraveling. "Let me go!" Claire shrieked, her voice swallowed by the roaring sound of the vortex. The clock opened. The glass face shattered outward, revealing an impossibly deep chasm inside. The shadows pulled her closer, and she could see shapes moving within the darkness, twisted humanoid figures with glowing red eyes and grotesque, clawed hands. They reached for her, their mouths opening in silent screams. "No, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. As her body was dragged into the clock, she felt a searing pain, as though her very essence were being torn apart. The last thing she saw was the twisted, screaming faces carved into the clock's surface. They weren't carvings at all, they were real. They were the faces of others who had been pulled inside. The room fell silent. The clock's pendulum began to swing again, its ticking slow and steady. The fire reignited in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The photo albums were back on the table, perfectly arranged. There was no sign of Claire. The clock's hands moved forward past midnight as though nothing had happened. When Claire's friends came looking for her the next day, they found the house empty. Her belongings were still there, her car parked in the driveway, but Claire was gone without a trace. The only thing out of place was the grandfather clock. Its pendulum swung back and forth, steady and relentless. If anyone had listened closely, they might have heard the faint sound of screaming, muffled and distant, coming from within the clock's depths. But no one did. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet, unassuming place where whispers of old legends lingered like the morning fog. The most chilling among them was the tale of Midnight, a name spoken in hushed tones by those brave or foolish enough to recall it. It was said that midnight wasn't just an hour, but an entity, a fleeting, malevolent force that emerged when the clock struck 12. Emma had never been one for ghost stories. A freelance journalist with a penchant for debunking the supernatural, she saw the Midnight Tale as just another local myth to unravel. When her editor assigned her to cover the haunted hour of Willow Creek, Emma packed her camera, recorder, and a healthy dose of skepticism. She arrived on December 21st, the longest night of the year, eager to disprove the legend. Her destination was Hollow's End Manor, an abandoned Victorian house on the edge of town, said to be the epicenter of Midnight's presence. The house loomed against the starless sky, its once grand facade weathered and crumbling. Locals claimed no one had entered and emerged unscathed in decades, a perfect setting for her article. Emma pushed open the creaking gate and stepped onto the weed-choked path leading to the door. A biting wind clawed at her coat, but she pressed on. She turned her camera on and narrated confidently. Willow Creek's Midnight legend claims that if you're inside Hollow's End at exactly 12, you'll meet something unnatural. Tonight, we separate fact from fiction. Inside, the house was a time capsule of decay. Cobwebs draped chandeliers, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and rot. Emma's footsteps echoed as she moved cautiously through the grand foyer. Her flashlight beam danced across faded wallpaper and shattered picture frames. She set up her equipment in the parlor, a cavernous room with a fireplace that seemed to yawn with darkness. Her digital recorder rested on the mantel, and her camera faced the room. The time, 11:45 p.m. She had 15 minutes until midnight. Emma checked her watch and then the recorder. Still nothing unusual, she said. No sounds, no. A faint whisper stopped her mid-sentence. It was barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves. She swung her flashlight toward the source, but saw nothing. Just the wind, she muttered. But her pulse quickened. The clock on the mantel struck 11:50. 10 minutes. The whisper returned, louder this time, weaving through the room like a serpentine hiss. It wasn't the wind. It carried a cadence, an unnatural rhythm, as if it were forming words Emma couldn't understand. She stood, heart pounding, and scanned the room again. The beam of her flashlight caught a shadow darting across the far wall. Her rational mind screamed, drafts and shadows, but her instincts told her otherwise. 11:55. Emma's breath misted in the sudden chill. The temperature had plummeted, and an oppressive silence swallowed the house. Even the distant creaks and groans of the old structure had ceased. She felt like a bug trapped in amber, every sound and movement muffled by an unseen force. Her recorder crackled to life with static. Emma stared, unblinking, as the static gave way to a deep, guttural voice. Leave. Her stomach twisted, but she held her ground. This was what she'd come for. Proof. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling. The voice laughed, a low, hollow sound that seemed to rattle her very bones. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest. She gasped for breath, her vision tunneling. 11:59. Emma stumbled back, clutching her flashlight as the room seemed to warp around her. The walls shimmered, bending and stretching like a heat mirage. Her camera toppled, the lens cracking against the floor. The clock struck 12. A deafening chime rang out, but it wasn't from the old clock. This sound was metallic and otherworldly, resonating deep in her skull. The parlor dissolved into darkness. Not the absence of light, but a living, suffocating void. Emma's flashlight flickered and died. She stood in pitch blackness, heart thundering as she groped for her equipment. The void pressed closer, and she felt a presence. Not just near her, inside her. A cold, invasive sensation crawled through her veins, stealing her warmth and her will. Why are you here? The voice growled, now impossibly close. I wanted to understand. Emma stammered, tears streaming down her face. The darkness seemed to pulse with cruel laughter. Understand, you cannot comprehend me. You are but a flicker, and I am the void. Suddenly, a pair of eyes burned into existence, red as embers and filled with a hatred so ancient it made her knees buckle. The eyes floated in the abyss, drawing closer. A skeletal hand, pale and clawed, reached toward her. Emma screamed, her voice swallowed by the void. The hand gripped her wrist and searing pain shot through her arm. It felt as though her soul were being wrenched from her body. She thrashed, but the entity's grip was unyielding. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The darkness receded, leaving Emma crumpled on the floor. The parlor was as it had been, eerily quiet. Her recorder and flashlight were gone. Only the broken camera remained, its memory card corrupted. Emma staggered out of the house, trembling and disoriented. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it. She fled without looking back, her heart hammering in her chest. The next morning, she reviewed her notes and found only one thing intact: a single audio file on her phone. She hesitated before playing it. The file was brief, just a few seconds long. It was her voice, shaking and distant, followed by a low whisper that made her blood run cold. Midnight is forever. Emma quit journalism that day. She left Willow Creek and never returned. The town's legend continued, fueled by her silence and the haunted look in her eyes. And Hollow's End remained, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek the truth. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The town of Black Hollow was shrouded in mist every night, the kind of mist that crawled into your lungs and made you shiver no matter how warm your coat was. Nestled deep in a forgotten valley, the town had one rule that every resident followed religiously: never go out at midnight. Visitors were rare, and those who stayed always had the same questions. Why midnight? What happens if you break the rule? But the townsfolk never answered, only muttering prayers and shaking their heads. Megan, a travel blogger in search of unique stories, arrived in Black Hollow just before dusk. The picturesque town, with its cobblestone streets and lantern-lit alleys, felt like stepping into a forgotten era. It was perfect for her blog, a quaint town with an air of mystery. She checked into the only inn, a creaky old building with faded wallpaper and a bell on the front desk that rang on its own occasionally. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a perpetual scowl, handed Megan a key and gave her a warning. Stay in your room after dark. No matter what you hear, don't open the door, and never look outside at midnight. Megan smiled politely, brushing it off as local superstition. That night, she set up her camera by the window to capture the eerie mist that rolled in with the darkness. The streets emptied quickly, and the town became deathly silent. By 11:45 p.m., Megan was bored. She reviewed her footage, disappointed that the mist didn't seem as haunting on film as it did in person. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside. Curiosity prickled her spine. Who would be out at this hour in a town so afraid of the night? Ignoring the innkeeper's warning, Megan peeked through the curtain. The street was empty, but the mist had thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns. She frowned, her breath fogging the glass. A shadow moved at the edge of the lamplight, too quick to identify. She pressed her face closer, trying to see. The clock struck midnight. The first chime was deafening, reverberating through the room and rattling the window. Megan stumbled back, her heart racing. The footsteps outside grew louder, heavier, as though someone or something was climbing the stairs to her room. She grabbed her phone, its screen lighting up with the time. 12 a.m. A second chime echoed and the air grew icy. Megan's breath came in sharp gasps as she heard a faint whisper, barely audible but undeniably there. "Let me in." Her blood ran cold. The whisper came again, closer this time, accompanied by soft knocks on her door. "Let me in." Megan froze. It wasn't just a voice, it was layered, overlapping whispers that sent shivers down her spine. She crept to the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob, curiosity and fear battling for control. The whisper turned into a guttural growl. "Let me in." Something slammed against the door, shaking it in its frame. Megan stumbled back, panic surging through her. She clutched her phone, dialing for help, but the screen flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The knocks turned into furious pounding, the force so strong it seemed the door might break. Megan pressed herself against the wall, trembling. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The pounding stopped. Silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Megan's heart felt like it might burst. She stared at the door, her mind racing for a way out. The window. She turned to the window, fumbling to open it, but the glass was ice cold, frost forming on the inside. A low, inhuman laugh echoed through the room. She turned back to the door just as it creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. No hallway, no staircase, just a yawning void that seemed to pull the light from the room. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, its body wrapped in shadows that writhed like smoke. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, those burning, crimson eyes, pierced through her, freezing her in place. Megan wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stretched out a long, skeletal hand, its claws glinting in the faint light. The whispers returned, louder, filling her ears with incomprehensible words that made her head spin. "You opened the door," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal on stone. The figure lunged and everything went black. Megan was never seen again. Her room at the inn was untouched, her belongings neatly packed. The only sign that she had been there was her camera, still perched on the windowsill. The last video showed the empty street, the swirling mist, and, at exactly midnight, a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at the lens. The townsfolk said nothing. Another visitor lost to midnight's curse, another warning ignored. And the town of Black Hollow continued its quiet, haunted existence, waiting for the next soul to defy the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The old farmhouse on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years, its sagging roof and shattered windows a stark reminder of its tragic history. People said it was cursed, a place where time stopped and the dead lingered. Most avoided it, but for Nathan, the allure of the unknown was irresistible. As a self-proclaimed skeptic and amateur investigator of the paranormal, he thrived on debunking ghost stories. The locals had warned him, of course. They said strange things happened at the farmhouse when the clock struck midnight. Some spoke of whispers in the dark, others of shadowy figures that moved in the periphery of vision. The bravest of them never stayed past sundown. But Nathan didn't believe in ghosts. To him, the stories were just remnants of folklore, and he was determined to prove it. He arrived at the farmhouse just as the last light of the day faded. The skeletal trees surrounding the property cast long shadows, their branches clawing at the dimming sky. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a digital recorder, Nathan stepped onto the creaking porch. The air was still, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made your skin crawl. Inside, the house smelled of decay and damp wood. The floors groaned under his weight, and cobwebs hung thick in every corner. He set up his equipment in the living room, the largest and eeriest space, with its peeling wallpaper and a fireplace that seemed to gape like a mouth. A single clock hung above the mantel, its hands frozen at midnight. Nathan chuckled to himself as he noted the clock's broken state. "Convenient," he muttered, snapping a photo of it. He set his digital recorder on the mantel and checked his watch. 11:30 p.m. He had 30 minutes to kill before the supposed witching hour. As the minutes ticked by, he wandered through the house, snapping pictures and narrating his observations into the recorder. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just an old, decrepit building slowly succumbing to time. He laughed at the thought of the ghost stories. How could anyone believe in such nonsense? At 11:55, he returned to the living room. The air felt colder now, though he dismissed it as a draft. He checked his watch again, noting the time. 5 minutes to midnight, he said into the recorder. Still nothing unusual. The house remained silent, save for the occasional groan of the wood beneath him. But as the clock crept closer to 12, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The silence deepened, becoming almost tangible, like a weight pressing against his chest. He shook it off, chalking it up to nerves. His watch beeped. Midnight. He waited, ears straining for any sound, but the house remained still. Relief washed over him. They hove, and he chuckled. "Another busted legend," he said aloud, reaching for his recorder. Then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves. He froze, his hand hovering over the recorder. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The whisper came again, clearer this time, but he couldn't make out the words. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway. Nathan grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the hallway. The beam illuminated the peeling wallpaper and the broken floorboards, but nothing else. "Probably the wind," he muttered, though his pulse quickened. He stepped toward the hallway, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, as though someone were speaking just out of sight. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the empty house. The whisper stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan stood frozen, every nerve in his body on edge. Then, from behind him, a floorboard creaked. He spun around, the flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. His breath came in short gasps as he tried to calm himself. "It's just an old house," he told himself. "Old houses make noises." But then he noticed the clock. The hands, which had been frozen at midnight, were moving. Slowly, they ticked backward, the sound sharp and deliberate. He stared in disbelief, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The clock struck 11:59, its chime low and mournful. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the spot as the air grew colder, each breath forming a cloud of mist. The room darkened, the weak light from his flashlight barely piercing the oppressive shadows. The clock struck midnight again. This time the chime was deafening, reverberating through the house like a tolling bell. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling together in the center of the floor. Nathan watched in horror as they took shape, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure moved toward him, its footsteps silent, its form flickering like a distorted image. Nathan stumbled back, his flashlight beam wavering. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. But the figure didn't stop. It raised a skeletal hand pointing at him. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. Nathan's mind raced, every rational thought drowned by sheer terror. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he fled toward the front door. But the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the door always just out of reach. Behind him, the whispering returned, louder and more frantic. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the shadows closing in, writhing like living things. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, suffocating and inescapable. He finally reached the door and threw it open, stumbling out onto the porch. The mist outside was thicker now, swirling like a storm. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, fumbling with the keys before throwing himself inside. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, the farmhouse disappearing into the mist behind him. Nathan didn't stop driving until he was miles away, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. When he finally dared to pull over, he sat in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the digital recorder, which he had grabbed in his panic. With trembling hands, he pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, came the whispering. The same incomprehensible voices he had heard in the house. His blood ran cold as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, clear as day, came the guttural voice. "You shouldn't be here." Nathan threw the recorder out the window and drove straight home, vowing never to return to Black Hollow. He never told anyone what happened that night, but he couldn't escape it. The memory haunted him, the shadows creeping into his dreams, and no matter how far he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, watching and waiting for the next time the clock struck midnight. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was 11:50 p.m. when Sarah felt the first chill sweep through the house. She had been alone for hours, working late in her study, the only light in the room the dim glow from her desk lamp. The wind outside howled, and the old windows rattled in their frames. It was the kind of night when the shadows seemed darker, and every creak of the floorboards echoed in her ears. The house, a century-old Victorian, had always felt a little off to her. No matter how much she cleaned, there were corners that stayed cold, as though something or someone had been there long before her. She stood up from her desk and stretched, her neck aching from hours of hunched-over work. The clock on the wall showed 11:52 p.m. She decided it was time to take a break and get some fresh air before heading to bed. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, trying to shake off the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. The house was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't just the silence of a late hour, but a deeper kind of quiet. the kind that made her skin crawl. Her footsteps echoed too loudly as she walked back through the dark hallway, the old wooden floors groaning under her weight. As she passed the staircase, she felt it, a brief, almost imperceptible coldness like a draft had brushed against her skin. She paused, listening for any sign of movement, but heard nothing. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. It was just the house settling, just the wind outside. She reached her bedroom, closed the door behind her, and locked it. Sarah had always been a little paranoid about being alone at night in that house, but tonight, the feeling seemed stronger than usual. The clock on the nightstand blinked 11:58 p.m. She turned off the lamp, slipped under the covers, and closed her eyes, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation that seemed to hang in the air. The minutes dragged on, and Sarah could feel her heartbeat slowly rising, the tension building in her chest. She shifted restlessly, her mind replaying the eerie silence she'd felt earlier, the strange draft. It was probably just her imagination, she thought. There was nothing to be afraid of. But then, just as she was about to fall into a fitful sleep, she heard it. A soft whisper. It came from downstairs, faint but unmistakable, a voice low and almost melodic calling her name. Sarah. Her eyes snapped open, her body frozen with fear. She strained to listen, the silence of the room amplifying the sound. There it was again, clearer this time, more insistent. Sarah, her breath caught in her throat. No one else was in the house. She was alone. Her heart raced, pounding in her ears as she slowly sat up in bed. The whisper sounded almost familiar, but it couldn't be. It was impossible. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and checked the time. It was 12:01 a.m. now, the witching hour. A chill ran down her spine as she listened intently, her body tense, ready to spring into action if she needed to. The whisper came again, closer now, as if the voice was right outside her door. Sarah. Her pulse quickened. Her eyes darted to the door. It was locked, but she had no idea who or what was standing outside. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a dream, maybe it was the wind, maybe someone had broken into the house and was trying to mess with her. But then she heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping against the floor. Her breath caught. It was coming from downstairs, the same direction as the whisper. Slowly, cautiously, she stood up and tiptoed toward the door. The house creaked under her feet, each step louder than the last. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Before she could turn it, there was a loud thud from downstairs. The sound echoed through the house, so jarring and sudden that Sarah jumped back, her heart racing. She swallowed hard, her mind spinning. She was alone. She had to be. She grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and stepped out of her room, making her way down the narrow hallway. The house felt colder now, the air thick with a strange, oppressive weight. The walls seemed to close in on her as she descended the stairs, each step feeling like it took longer than the last. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. She stepped carefully into the room, scanning the shadows, expecting to see someone or something waiting. But the room was empty. No intruders. No signs of a break-in. Sarah's breathing steadied, though the sense of unease remained. She took a few more steps forward, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls, and then suddenly she froze. There, at the foot of the staircase, was a figure, a tall, thin shadow, standing perfectly still. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. But there was something off about him. His body was shrouded in darkness, his features indistinguishable, like he was part of the shadows themselves. Who are you? Sarah's voice trembled, barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, motionless. Her blood ran cold as the figure slowly began to move, its feet dragging across the floor, just like the sound she had heard earlier. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs were frozen, her body unwilling to obey. The figure took another step forward, its form becoming more defined in the dim light. And then, as it stepped into the beam of her flashlight, Sarah gasped. It wasn't a man at all. The figure had no face, no eyes, no mouth. It was just a blank, featureless void, a patch of darkness where a face should have been. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if the space itself was warping. Sarah? The voice returned, this time louder, more distorted. It was coming from the figure. Come closer. Her breath caught in her throat as terror surged through her body. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor as she bolted back toward the stairs. But as she reached the bottom step, the figure was there, blocking her way. "Don't run from me," the voice whispered, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she tried to back away, her heart pounding in her chest. She was trapped. There was no escape. The figure advanced, its steps slow and deliberate, the darkness around it growing thicker, suffocating the room. "Midnight is the hour," the figure hissed, its voice 1,000 whispers. "You belong to me now." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the house was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. The room was empty, save for Sarah, trembling and gasping for breath. Her mind raced, but she didn't dare move. She stayed frozen in place, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the house was silent again. No whispers. No scraping sounds, just the eerie hum of the lights overhead. With a shaky hand, Sarah checked the time on her phone. 12:10 a.m. The witching hour had passed. But as Sarah stood there, still gripped by fear, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The house had never truly been empty. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
It was just after midnight when Ethan woke up with a jolt, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what had disturbed him, but something felt off, like the air itself had shifted. He glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 12:03 a.m. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of streetlights outside the window. He turned over, trying to shake the feeling of unease creeping over him, but it lingered. The house was silent, unnaturally so. He tried to convince himself that it was just the time of night, that everything was fine, but his gut told him otherwise. There was a faint noise, like a soft creak coming from the hallway outside his room. Ethan held his breath, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. He tried to dismiss it as the house settling, as old houses tend to do, but something about the noise didn't sit right with him. Another creak. Louder this time. It was unmistakable. Ethan sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. He was alone in the house, at least he should be. His wife, Laura, had left town that morning for a work trip, and the kids were with her mother for the weekend. The house should have been quiet, peaceful even, but instead, there was something wrong. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, his feet cold against the wooden floor. The hallway outside his bedroom was pitch black, but he could just make out the outline of the stairs leading down to the main floor. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The creaking noise was louder now, almost rhythmic, as if something was slowly moving across the floor. His heart thudded in his chest, and he stepped toward the door, every instinct telling him to turn on the lights, to break the silence. But he didn't. He couldn't explain it, but there was something in the air that made him afraid to disturb the quiet. As Ethan reached for the doorknob, it felt as though the temperature in the hallway had dropped several degrees. He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cold air. This wasn't just the usual nighttime chill. It was something else. Something unnatural. With a deep breath, he opened the door. The hallway stretched in front of him, the darkness pressing in. The sound of the creaking had stopped, but Ethan's mind raced, and every hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He took a cautious step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The house seemed still, too still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. He reached the top of the stairs and peered down. Everything was dark below. No lights, no movement. He took another step, his hand gripping the railing as he descended the stairs slowly. The air felt thick now, like he was wading through fog. Then, a soft whisper. "Ethan." The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. It came from below, from the living room. He froze mid-step, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was low, guttural, as if it was coming from somewhere deep in the house. He could feel the hairs on his neck stand up. There was no one else in the house. No one. He had checked the doors and windows before going to bed. This was impossible. "Ethan," the voice repeated, a little louder this time, more insistent. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He turned his head slowly, his flashlight now trembling in his hand. The beam illuminated the hallway, then flicked to the living room door at the end of the hall. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. A man, tall and thin, his back facing Ethan, standing motionless in the doorway. But there was something wrong about him. His posture was unnatural, as though he was too stiff, too still. Ethan, the voice was clearer now, but it didn't come from the figure. It was coming from the house itself, echoing in every direction, filling the space around him. The figure in the doorway turned slowly, its head tilting at an odd angle. As it did, Ethan saw its face, or rather what was supposed to be its face. It was a blank, featureless expanse of pale skin, smooth and devoid of any expression. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a lifeless, empty mask. Ethan staggered back, his body shaking as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. His thoughts were jumbled, a swirl of panic and confusion. He tried to speak, to shout, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his voice stuck in his chest. The figure took a slow step toward him, its feet dragging along the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. With each movement, the air grew colder, the room darker, as though the shadows were deepening around him. "Why are you here?" Ethan finally managed to croak, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The answer was already in the air, hanging between them, heavy with a presence Ethan couldn't understand. He didn't know who or what this thing was, but he knew it wasn't human. It wasn't real, not in any sense he understood. It was something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong. The figure took another step, and Ethan felt a sharp, ice-cold gust of wind blow past him. He looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. A pool of shadow was spreading across the floor, creeping toward him like ink spilling from a bottle, its tendrils reaching for his feet. "Ethan," the voice echoed again, but this time it was different. It sounded like many voices, layered over each other, whispering in tongues. "Ethan, come with us." Before Ethan could move, the figure lunged forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, like shadows themselves. The room was now pitch black, the light from his phone flickering and dying, and he felt the cold fingers of something invisible brush against his skin, pulling him closer. His legs buckled beneath him, and he stumbled backward, his hands reaching out for anything to steady himself. But there was nothing. The floor was slick with cold, and the walls around him seemed to close in, narrowing as though the house itself was shrinking. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The figure was gone. The shadows receded. The silence returned, oppressive and suffocating. Ethan collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His head spun, his vision blurred. The house was still. Too still. He checked the time on his phone. 12:15 a.m. The witching hour had passed. But even as he stood up and shakily backed away toward the stairs, he could still feel it. Something was watching him, something that shouldn't be here. The house was never truly empty. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The storm outside had grown violent by the time James sat down on his couch, staring at the rain battering against the windows. The howling wind sounded like a chorus of lost souls, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the room in harsh, unsettling bursts. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 12:02 a.m. He had been in the house alone for hours now, and the silence felt thick, almost suffocating. His wife, Kate, had left on a late business trip, and the house felt vast and empty without her. James tried to ignore the discomfort in his chest, the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. It was just the storm, he told himself, the storm and the isolation. He looked at his phone, checking for any messages from Kate, but the screen remained empty. She had texted him earlier that her flight had been delayed, but there had been no updates since. Sighing, he set the phone down and reached for the remote, trying to distract himself with a movie. Just as he pressed play, a loud crash from upstairs jolted him from the couch. His head snapped toward the staircase, his heart thudding in his chest. His breath caught as he listened. The house was silent again, save for the rhythmic pounding of the rain against the windows. James stood up slowly, his mind racing. What could that have been? He thought for a moment, but then dismissed the idea. It was probably just the storm. The house was old, after all. Old houses had their quirks, noises that couldn't be explained. But then came another noise. This time, it was a soft, dragging sound, followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. James froze. His blood ran cold. The footsteps were coming from upstairs, and they were getting closer. He could hear the distinct sound of something, or someone, walking down the hallway toward the stairs. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He grabbed his phone from the coffee table and quickly dialed Kate's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. She must have turned off her phone. His thoughts spun wildly. No one else was in the house. He was alone. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound calm. "Kate? Is that you?" There was no response. The footsteps continued, moving slowly, methodically, as if they were pacing back and forth outside his bedroom door. James felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his skin prickling with dread. He stood there, rooted to the spot, for what felt like an eternity. The footsteps paused, and then he heard the sound of a door creaking open, his bedroom door. A chill swept through the room, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He swallowed hard, heart pounding, and then, without thinking, he bolted toward the staircase. He needed to check the upstairs, needed to know what was making those noises. He had to confront whatever it was. His feet pounded against the stairs as he climbed quickly, his hand gripping the railing as if it could somehow steady his racing heart. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard it again, the sound of footsteps followed by a faint creak of the floorboards in his bedroom. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the bedroom door open. The room was dark, save for the dim light from the storm outside that filtered through the curtains. His eyes swept the room quickly, scanning every corner, but it was empty. The floorboards creaked beneath him as he stepped inside, but there was no one here. He turned back toward the door, but that's when he noticed it. The bed. The covers had been pulled back, as if someone had been sitting there. The chill in the room intensified, and a whispering sound filled the air, so soft he could barely make it out. It came from the corner of the room, near the window. "James," his blood ran cold. The voice was not Kate's. It was low, raspy, almost like a hiss. He whipped around, his flashlight beam dancing wildly over the room. There was no one there. The whisper came again, this time louder, as though it was right behind him. "James." He spun back toward the door, but as he did, something caught his eye. There, standing in the shadow by the window, was a figure. It was tall and thin, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by shadows. The thing was not fully human, its limbs too long, too distorted. It seemed to be made of the very darkness in the room, shifting in and out of focus like a nightmare he couldn't escape. "Get out," the figure whispered, its voice guttural, echoing in the room like 1,000 voices layered together. James's blood ran cold, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He stumbled backward, his legs weak, and in that instant, the figure moved. The thing didn't walk. It glided, its feet barely touching the floor, its body swaying as though it were drifting through the air. It closed the distance between them in a split second, faster than anything human should have been able to move. "Leave," it hissed, its face still hidden, but the presence of its voice felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. James's mind raced. His body refused to obey. He couldn't run. He couldn't move. All he could do was stand there, paralyzed by terror as the figure drew closer. The storm outside intensified and the lights flickered, casting eerie, erratic shadows on the walls. The thing reached out, a long, pale hand extending toward him, its fingers impossibly long, twisting like vines. A sudden crash of thunder snapped James out of his paralysis. His legs finally responded and he bolted from the room, sprinting down the hallway and toward the stairs. But as he reached the top step, he looked back one last time. The figure was standing at the top of the stairs now, its featureless face still hidden in darkness, its body shifting, becoming one with the shadows of the house, and it was staring directly at him. "Midnight," the voice whispered, echoing in his mind. "The hour is upon you." With a terrified cry, James turned and ran down the stairs, the footsteps of the figure following behind him, a constant, relentless sound that echoed in his head. He didn't dare look back as he reached the front door, tearing it open and stumbling out into the storm. The wind howled around him, the rain soaking him through, but he didn't care. He ran through the yard, desperate to get away from the house, away from whatever had been inside. As he reached the gate, he dared one final look over his shoulder. The house stood there, dark and silent, the windows staring back at him like vacant eyes. But in the reflection of the window, standing in the dark hallway, he saw it once more. The figure watching him from within the house. The storm raged on, but James knew that no matter how far he ran, the darkness would follow. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was just past midnight when Sarah's phone rang. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the screen as she debated whether to pick up. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it. She had been getting strange calls all week, but something told her that this one was different. She swiped to answer. Hello? The line was silent at first. Then a soft voice, barely a whisper, came through the speaker. Sarah? Her heart skipped a beat. It was her name, unmistakable, but the voice, faint, breathless, sounded like it was coming from far away, as if the person on the other end were in a different room, or maybe even a different world altogether. Who is this? Sarah's voice trembled despite her attempt to sound calm. No response. Only silence, thick and oppressive, stretched out for what felt like an eternity. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She was alone in the house, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant rumble of thunder from the storm outside. Then the voice returned, this time clearer, more urgent. Sarah, I need you to listen to me. Her blood ran cold. The voice, it was familiar, too familiar. Who is this? She repeated, her pulse quickening. What do you want? The voice paused for a moment, then spoke again, but this time the words were more guttural, strained. You have to leave. Right now, you're not alone. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Her thoughts scrambled. The only person who knew her name, who would know she was home, was Mark, her ex-husband. But he hadn't called her in months. She hadn't heard from him since the night he disappeared. A sharp crack of thunder interrupted her thoughts, and the phone line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah sat frozen, staring at the phone in her hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing across the sky, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah swallowed hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What had she just heard? The voice had sounded like Mark, but he was gone. Her thoughts raced. Mark had gone missing 2 months ago, on a night just like this. He had gone out for a late-night walk in the woods behind their house, but never came back. The police had searched for days, but there was no sign of him. No explanation, just a sudden disappearance. Sarah stood up, pacing the room, her mind spinning. There was no way it could be him on the phone. No way. But the voice, the warning, it was as though it was reaching out to her from beyond the grave, trying to tell her something. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Mark, it wasn't over. She felt the air grow colder. The temperature in the room seemed to drop all at once, and Sarah's breath misted in front of her. The hairs on her arms stood on end. Then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the phone buzzed again, startling her. It was a text message. Sarah hesitated before opening it, a cold shiver running through her. She read the words aloud to herself, though she didn't want to believe them. You're not safe. The house is watching you. Get out. Her pulse quickened. She looked around the room, suddenly aware of the stillness, the heavy silence pressing in on her. She felt as though eyes were watching her from every corner, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She turned on her heels, glancing toward the windows. The storm outside had grown fiercer, the rain lashing against the panes like fingers tapping, demanding attention. Sarah's mind raced. The message? Could it have been sent by someone else? She tried calling Mark's number, but it went straight to voicemail, just as it had for weeks. She felt a tug in the pit of her stomach, a gut feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Her body was telling her to leave, to run. She grabbed her jacket and rushed toward the door. But as her hand touched the doorknob, the lights flickered and the phone rang again. She looked down at the screen. The number was the same as before, the one that had sent the text. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to answer it, but something inside her compelled her to. With trembling hands, she swiped to accept the call. Sarah, the voice said again, faint but clear, you need to leave, now. Her blood ran cold. This time, she didn't hesitate. She turned the doorknob, pushing the door open just as a loud crash of thunder filled the room, causing the lights to go out entirely. The house was plunged into darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat and she fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. But when the light flickered on, she froze. Standing in the hallway just beyond the door was a figure. A tall, shadowy form, its face obscured in darkness. It wasn't Mark, but the figure was undeniably human. It was moving toward her slowly, its footsteps almost soundless like a predator stalking its prey. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the floor. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure came closer, the light from her phone revealing its features. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and a twisted, contorted smile. Then it spoke. Sarah. The voice was distorted, warped, like a faint echo from somewhere else. You should have listened. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward her, impossibly long, its fingers scraping against the walls as it drew closer. Sarah finally snapped out of her paralysis and stumbled backward, her phone falling to the floor with a dull thud. She turned and ran, sprinting toward the back door. But when she reached the door, it was locked. She fumbled with the handle, her breath shallow and panicked, but the door wouldn't open. She turned to look over her shoulder, and her stomach twisted. The figure was right behind her now, its breath cold against her neck. She could hear it whispering her name, over and over, like a chant. Sarah! 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 Suddenly, there was a loud bang from above her, as if something heavy had fallen. The house shook, the walls groaning, and Sarah looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. She saw it now, the shadows moving across the ceiling, crawling like living things, following the figure. Her fingers trembled as she tried the door again. This time, it opened. She ran out into the pouring rain, gasping for air, her eyes wild with terror. But as she stumbled into the yard, she stopped. The figure was standing at the door, watching her. Its smile stretched unnaturally wide, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. Sarah, it whispered again, its voice now coming from all around her. It's too late. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and for a moment she couldn't tell if the earth was swallowing her or if she was sinking into the dark void that surrounded her. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the world went black. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was just past midnight when Marissa heard the first knock on the door. It was faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind outside, but there was no mistaking it. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 taps. A pause. Then 2 more. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 12:08 a.m. Her apartment was on the top floor of an old building in a quiet part of town. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and the weather outside had turned sour. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind rattled the panes. The building was old, creaky, and the hallway was usually silent at night. A knock at this hour was strange enough to send a ripple of unease through her chest. She stood up from the couch where she had been reading, her thoughts already racing. Was it a neighbor? Maybe someone needing help? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized no one ever came by this late, and certainly not in this storm. Her heartbeat quickened as she cautiously approached the door. She peered through the peephole. There was nothing, just a dark hallway. Her hand hesitated over the doorknob. Another knock echoed through the hall, this time louder, sharper. Knock, 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 knock. Marissa froze. It was different, more insistent, and it didn't feel right. She reached for the deadbolt, locking it into place before taking a few steps back. Her pulse raced as her eyes darted around the apartment. She was alone, just her and the storm. No one else was supposed to be here. Not now. Another knock. Knock, knock, knock. She quickly grabbed her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed the building super. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the call button, waiting for the ringing to end. But the line went straight to voicemail. Her stomach tightened. Her gut told her something was wrong. Something wasn't right. There was another knock, this time louder. She flinched at the noise, her heart hammering in her chest. It was relentless. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a regular knock. It felt different, heavy, as though something or someone was trying to break through. The air around her seemed to grow colder, as if the storm had invaded the apartment itself. Her mind raced. She thought about calling the police, but something held her back. The knocks continued, each one seeming to shake the walls. With a deep breath, Marissa turned toward the window. The storm had intensified. She could barely see out of the glass, the rain blurring everything. The shadows outside were thick with darkness. Then, a flash of lightning lit up the room, and for a brief moment she saw something. A figure. It was standing just outside her window, tall and shrouded in the storm. The figure was barely visible, cloaked in shadows, its shape obscured by the rain. But in that fleeting moment of light, she saw it. Standing there, unmoving, its presence so cold that it seemed to freeze the air around her. She blinked, and when she looked back, it was gone. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't from the door. It was coming from the window. Knock, knock, knock. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear the storm outside. She slowly approached the window, her mind a blur of panic and confusion. She didn't know what she was hoping to see, or maybe what she was hoping not to see. But as she got closer, the outline of the figure became clear once again. It was standing right there, just outside the window. This time she didn't blink. She didn't want to miss it. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its body stretched impossibly thin. Its face was completely black, no features, just emptiness. And as the lightning flashed again, Marissa could see the outline of its long, bony hands pressed against the window pane. It didn't move, not even an inch. It just stood there, staring at her through the glass. A deep, primal fear rooted Marissa to the spot. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure outside seemed to know. It slowly tilted its head as if acknowledging her fear, as if it had been waiting for her to notice. The window rattled, and then the knocking started again, but this time it was loud and urgent. Marissa backed away, stumbling, her eyes never leaving the window. The knocking didn't stop. It was deafening. It shook the very walls of the apartment, the glass vibrating with each impact. And then all at once, the knocking stopped. The air grew eerily still. Marissa's breath was ragged, her heart racing. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something, but her body was frozen in place. She glanced back at the window. The figure was gone, but something else had replaced it. The reflection. There in the window was her own face, but it wasn't hers. The eyes staring back at her were wide with terror, and the mouth, it wasn't her mouth. It was stretched into a grotesque smile, twisted and wrong. A deep, unnatural blackness pooled in the reflection, swirling around her image as if something else were moving beneath her skin. Marissa turned away in horror, but the reflection remained. The face in the window continued to smile, its expression mocking her. Her legs felt weak. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, and as she staggered back toward the door, she heard it again. A voice, low and drawn out, barely audible over the storm. Marissa? It was her name, but it wasn't her own voice. The voice came from everywhere, from all directions, from inside her own mind. Marissa, you shouldn't have looked. The walls seemed to close in around her as she backed into the corner of the room, her eyes flicking from the window to the door to the darkness beyond. Then, in the darkness of the corner, something moved. A shadow detached itself from the corner and slithered toward her, its form stretching and twisting unnaturally, growing longer with every step. The shadow spoke again, but this time the words weren't in her mind. They were in the room, thick and suffocating. Come to me. The air in the room went ice cold, and Marissa's knees buckled beneath her. The shadow reached for her, its fingers like the talons of some ancient creature. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt its icy touch brush her cheek. In that moment, the knocking began again, this time louder than ever, shaking the walls, filling the entire apartment. Bang. Bang, bang. But it wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Marissa screamed as the darkness swallowed her whole. Story the end.
Story number 10.
At midnight, everything felt eerily still. Emma had lived in the old farmhouse for nearly a year, a quiet retreat away from the noise of the city. She had found it on a whim after a painful breakup, seeking solitude and peace in the rolling hills of the countryside. The house itself was older than she'd first realized when she moved in. Built in the 1800s, it creaked and groaned like a living thing. At first, she found the sounds charming, part of its character. But now, after months of living there alone, they began to make her uneasy. It wasn't just the creaks, it was the whispers in the dark, faint but unmistakable. It was the feeling that she was being watched. Emma had tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just the wind, the house settling, or her imagination playing tricks on her. But as time went on, the sensations grew harder to ignore. It was just past midnight when it happened again. Emma was in her bed, reading a book to lull herself to sleep. The rain had been pouring steadily all evening, tapping gently against the windows, a soothing sound. But now, there was something else, something more insistent. A soft knock. She froze, staring at the door, her pulse quickening. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock didn't sound like it came from the door at all. It came from the walls, soft, rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers against the wood. It came again, and then once more. 3 distinct knocks. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a cold chill sweep through the room, the air growing heavy. The clock on the nightstand blinked 12:05 a.m. The house was still, but the knocking continued. Emma sat up slowly, her breath shallow. She told herself it was just the house. Old houses made noises. But this felt different. It was deliberate. Someone was out there. Her thoughts raced as she tried to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. The knocking came again, more forceful this time. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, the only light in the room now coming from its screen. She considered calling someone, her friend, her brother, the police, but she didn't know what she would say. "Someone's knocking on my wall?" It sounded insane, even to her. The knocking stopped. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, but the silence that followed was unsettling. The wind outside howled, the rain splattering against the window like 1,000 tiny hands. But then, just as she started to relax, there was something else. A sound from the hallway, faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. She strained to listen, trying to make sense of the noises, but there was nothing. No one was supposed to be there. The house was empty, except for her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She didn't know what to do. Should she check? Should she just stay in bed, pretending she hadn't heard anything? The thought of leaving the safety of her covers terrified her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder. Someone was walking down the hallway outside her door. Slowly, methodically. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling again, that it was all in her head. But there was a weight to the footsteps that felt too real, too deliberate. And as they came closer to her bedroom door, the fear rose in her chest like a tidal wave. She gripped the covers tightly, her knuckles white. Her heart raced in her chest. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. Nothing. For a long, agonizing moment, everything was still. Emma strained her ears, listening for any sound, but there was nothing but the distant sound of the storm. The house felt suffocatingly quiet. And then, the door handle began to turn. It was slow at first, almost gentle, as if someone on the other side was unsure whether to enter. Emma's breath hitched in her throat and she froze. Her whole body went rigid with terror. The door creaked open a fraction. Emma couldn't move. She couldn't speak. All she could do was watch as the crack in the door widened, just enough to let the faintest sliver of light spill into the room from the hallway. The shadows danced across the floor and she could feel the presence in the doorway, could feel its gaze on her. But there was nothing there. No one. No one was standing in the doorway. Yet she could still feel the presence, could still feel the weight of something, watching her, waiting. The air felt thick with dread, suffocating. And then out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. Just a flicker, a shadow moving across the room. She turned her head sharply, but there was nothing. Just the faint outlines of the furniture in the dark. But she could still feel it. Whatever it was there, in the room with her. The clock on the nightstand read 12:10 a.m. A whisper. Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't in her head. She heard it. The softest, most chilling whisper, like someone speaking directly into her ear. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the room was empty. The walls were still, the shadows deep and empty, and yet there was something there, pressing in on her, something that hadn't been there before. It felt old, ancient even, like the house had been alive long before she had ever stepped foot in it. A voice came again, louder this time. "Get out!" It was clear now. It was a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The voice was faint but filled with malice, like it was trying to crawl into her skin. The words felt like a command, an order she had no choice but to obey. "Get out." Emma's pulse raced. She had to leave. Had to leave. She couldn't stay here anymore. The room felt suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She jumped out of bed and grabbed her coat, her hands shaking. She didn't care about shoes. She didn't care about anything except getting out of this house. She moved toward the door, every instinct telling her to run. But as her fingers brushed the doorknob, the house groaned. The sound was low, like the very foundation was shifting beneath her feet. And then the door slammed shut. Emma stumbled back, gasping. The force of it was so strong it rattled the windows. The room seemed to spin around her as the oppressive feeling in the house intensified. She pressed her back against the wall, staring at the door. She could feel the thing on the other side. She could feel it moving in the shadows, its presence surrounding her. And then she heard it again, closer this time, like it was right beside her ear. "Get out!" Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in fear. It was so close now. She could feel it against her skin like a cold breath on her neck. She whipped around to find nothing there. No figure, no presence, just the same empty room. But she knew. She knew it was there. Suddenly, the air turned ice cold. Emma's breath came out in mist, her entire body shivering uncontrollably. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the shadows twisted and writhed like living things. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the dark shapes moving in the corner of her eye. And then the whisper came again, not from behind her, not from the shadows, but from within the walls. "Leave." The floor beneath her feet trembled as the walls seemed to shift, the very foundation of the house creaking as if something ancient and angry was awakening. With a scream that tore from her throat, Emma yanked open the door, breaking free from the suffocating grip of the house. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the darkness, and didn't stop until she was outside, into the freezing rain. But when she looked back at the house, the lights flickered on. The windows shone like eyes, watching her, waiting. And the whisper followed her into the night. Story the end.